Welcome back to the Know Your Adversary podcast. This is episode 3, and in this episode, we're going to explore some theoretical ideas behind attack path management. Specifically, 2 topics. One is this idea of an access graph versus an attack graph. We'll kind of talk about what the differences between those are and why it's important to have both perspectives. And then the second is this idea of identities at rest versus identities in transit. This is an idea that we came up with to kind of describe a phenomenon that we've encountered in red teams and during assessing attack paths in environments. And we think it's really important for people to understand this paradigm as they begin to kind of transition their thought process to seeing the world kind of like through the lens of the adversary. So Justin, we can start to talk about access graphs versus attack graphs. One of the things that we've noticed is that there's kind of a dichotomy between how people view the attacker's perspective. So in episode 1, we talked about this problem where attackers would have control over a certain identity. Maybe they phish a user and they have control of this user, and then they start to ask this question, which is, what resources do I have access to? What file shares can I read? What computers do I have admin control over? So on and so forth. You want to talk about that idea a little bit?
So I think like in the most basic sense, it's like if let's go to maybe hopefully the most common explanation of this. So a user has access to computers, and let's say you're in an Active Directory environment, but this applies anywhere. So a user has direct access to a computer. That means, let's say, admin rights. So they have admin rights over machines A, B, and C. That would be defined as like you're entered as the local admin on that computer, or maybe you have force change password over 3 specific people. That would be like direct access. And then there's this other group delegated access, right? So like I'm a member of this group and that gives me access to these machines, or I'm a member of the help desk administrators so I can reset people's passwords. That would be what we consider access graph. Like these are my permissions, whether they are direct or group delegated in the case of Active Directory, but they can be in other ways or other role-based access controls like in Azure or AWS. It kind of keeps going, but that's what we mean by access. I have access, I have direct access to this thing. This is as far as I can go as an individual or as an identity in the environment.
And it's when we start talking about access, it's an identity has control over a resource.
Yes.
Right? So they have some sort of ability. Typically, we talk about it kind of at a high level, a very coarse, what I would call a coarse grain kind of perspective, which is a lot of you are familiar with like this idea of read, write, execute. Right.
Yep.
So I have the ability to read a file. I have the ability to write to a file. I have the ability to execute a file. Right. That would be access. So it's kind of my control over a resource. And that's very important for us to understand how the access relationships between identities and resources, but it doesn't tell the full story, right? So there's this kind of secondary perspective, which we call the attack graph, which says, okay, we have the access graph as a foundation. So what can identity A access? But what we also want to layer on top of that is how can I, as an attacker, leverage the access or the control of a resource in order to take over an additional identity, right?
Yeah.
So there's this fundamental idea called the identity snowball attack, right? Which is, it's not that I'm switching from identity A to identity B. I'm accumulating access as I take control. I have control of identity A. I leverage some relationship to take over identity B. I now have control of both, right? So I've accumulated access as a result of my attack.
So it's like if I was phished, then an attacker has control over everything that I have access to. But let's say I had force reset password on you, then he would have both my access and your access. And so that's how the attack graph kind of begins to snowball. And this is, I mean, looking at it from the access perspective is useful from like an audit. Like Justin should not have access to these things because he does not need that for his role. But that is a super impartial way of looking at how can Justin's account be used to attack us. So it would be if I have control over Jared's account, again, it's not just what I have access to, it's what Jared also has access to that could threaten the environment. This is a huge, a big breakthrough that a lot of people go through, whether you're on the penetration testing side or the defensive side. Once you understand that it's not about what somebody has access to today, it's really the accumulation of it in totality that really matters. And that's, again, where attack paths are so kind of sneaky It can look pretty simple at first, but it actually spirals out of control real fast.
And Justin, not to put you on the spot because
No.
we didn't actually talk about this beforehand, but one of the things that we did in the preparation for this State of Attack Path Management report is we started to kind of analyze some statistics from like customers that we have visibility into. And can you talk about kind of the impact of attack paths as far as when you start talking about it spirals out of control?
Oh yeah.
What the impact of that is on an environment?
Yeah, like you're probably referring to like the total number of attack paths. Yeah.
Total number of attack paths, the total number of identities that like exposure of tier 0.
Oh yeah. So if you were, let's put some numbers to it. In an account with 10,000 employees, let's say, the direct relationships. So Jared might have access to these things, and Justin's account might have access to these things. Those are what we call relationships. So you have 10,000 employees, and then you have these relationships, which are like the different access levels that an identity might have over resources. We call those, again, relationships, and we count those. So let's say 10,000 employee environment might have 1 million or 2 or 3 million different relationships that make up that. That's probably on the low side, but going off the cuff. A way to think about the employee count and the relationship count is think about like cities and roads in a country. So the number of cities are the number of cities in the United States, and we've used this analogy a lot. The number of relationships is the number of roads connecting all those cities. Now the dangerous thing is how many routes or attack paths does that create? So think of how many unique ways are there to use the combination of cities and roads to traverse the United States. I'm explaining this because that's why the numbers get so bad. So you might have, let's say, 10,000 employees or 10,000 objects that are connected by a couple million relationships, which create hundreds of millions or billions of different unique routes from me as an attacker to land in your environment and get to something that really matters. And that's why I think a lot of people felt really helpless. It just felt like when somebody got in, they were reaching their objective. It was just a matter of time.
And this may be as a relationship with red team exercises, right?
Yeah.
So red team exercises are extraordinarily valuable from the perspective of we're going to exercise your incident response capability. We're going to provide you some sort of catalyst that's going to test your different capabilities, defensive capabilities. What it's not particularly great at is how do we start to make our environment more secure, right? So how do we eliminate these attack paths? The problem with a red team exercise, for instance, is that you're going to be executing 1 or 2 or single-digit numbers of attack paths.
Yeah.
And so the problem is that you, as Justin said, if there's billions of attack paths or hundreds of millions of attack paths, you're going to show 10 of those. Somebody's going to clean those up, and then next year we're going to come back and do another red team, and you're going to have the same problem, right? It's an inconsequential number of attack paths relative to the total number.
I mean, it is kind of a tangent, but like going back to the kind of early beginnings of Bloodhound, one of the problems was, if we use Bloodhound to find an attack path in an environment and debrief a client, it was almost a disservice. It was like, if you fix that attack path, yes, you should fix an attack path, but like that's 1 out of millions that we understand are in the background. So are you actually doing anything? You're actually probably giving yourself a false sense of security by cleaning that up and thinking, okay, my work's done, because the scale is huge. So again, like back to the point, access graphs are important to make sure that Jared has the rights that he should have access to do his role. That's kind of what we call least privilege. But I think the intent of that, the intent of least privilege is really not met with access graphs. When we think about least privilege, I think we're thinking, how can we prevent the sprawl of an adversary to take over some critical resource? And that doesn't matter whether it's my access, my direct access, or Jared's access that I can abuse my way to.
Yeah, and then can you talk about the exposure, initial exposure numbers?
Yeah, so exposure, when we talk about explain both, exposure and impact. So think of a single identity or asset. They have exposure, meaning these things can get to this place. So if I'm looking at Jared's account, well, who has control rights over Jared? So who can reset his password? Who can access a token on a host that he's accessed or a Windows session? So that's what we mean by exposure. So he might have exposure to some percentage or some count of employees in the environment. So let's say that's 50%. On the impact side, that's what Jared can control, and that's the total accumulation of control. So if we spread out as far as we can, understanding all of those different routes and relationships, how much of the environment could Jared take over? So we talk about them in two different ways, exposure and impact. When we talk about critical assets like tier 0 resources or a super administrator rights, so like global admin in Azure or AWS admin, what we're looking at is exposure primarily. So who can get access to that account to use it to take it over? Most of the time when we deploy in environments, we're looking at somewhere between 70 and 100% exposure for any tier 0 resource. So that would be, in a stereotypical Active Directory environment, that means like 70% of your users, and in some cases, hundreds of thousands of employees can be used to take over your domain controllers or domain admins or global admins or yada, yada, yada. It's extremely common. And when we first started deploying Bloodhound Enterprise, I came out with a blog post and I was like, I feel like a therapist, because everybody would ask me, is everybody this bad? And I'd say, yes, absolutely. I mean, this is what happens when 20 years of technical debt get piled on and nobody has kind of shine a light on the problem. We all felt it. We were all experiencing breaches, and we all got really frustrated with working with these systems, but we didn't know where the problem was coming from. So extremely common. Hopefully that's a very long-winded way of explaining.
I think the important thing is that we talked about how initial access is often this arbitrary, it grants this arbitrary starting point in the environment. And the big problem is that when 70, 80, 90% of your users have the ability to control your domain admins group, let's say, that's a bad situation, right? Because what you're trying to do, it's almost like game theory, to where what you're trying to do is get a situation to where it's more likely that the phished user does not have the ability to take over your domain than it is likely. And right now, kind of, if you're not doing anything from the attack path management perspective, the odds are on the opposite side, which is it doesn't matter who they phish because they probably will find a path.
I think we've probably been deployed. I mean, Bloodhound has been deployed in tens of thousands of environments, but we've seen thousands of environments ourselves, and I'd say I could probably count on one hand where we weren't in the above 50%. With the right data collection. So it's a big problem. Again, nobody's doing anything wrong. It's just how this snowballs, hence identity snowball, how like seemingly good access control on the least privilege side can sprawl out like crazy on the attack path side.
Yeah, in the military we have this idea of second order effects, right? Which is I grant access, I grant a help desk user the ability to change Justin's password. Well, that means that help desk user has the ability to control Justin's user account, which then means that they have access to whatever Justin has access to. And so a lot of times when we're thinking about the access graph, we have to think about what is the second and third order effect. What by granting this permission to that user over this resource, how is that going to allow them to then expand their access?
Yeah. And if you've never seen it before, it can be really kind of alarming. We've been in a couple conversations where people have said, I don't know that we would really benefit much from this, or I don't think we have this problem because we separate our users from their administrators. And again, like we don't want to be accusatory, but usually it's I'll believe you, but you'd be the first one. Usually people think that they've separated them, but there are always underlying privileges that are connecting lower resource or lower privilege resources to higher privilege resources.
Going back to your map analogy, sometimes it's an interstate that's connecting them, sometimes it's a dirt road, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in one decision, snowballs in like crazy ways.
Yep. So the second idea that I wanted to kind of explore a little bit in this episode is this idea of identities at rest and identities in transit. A lot of you that are watching this are probably familiar with this idea of data at rest versus data in transit from a data protection perspective, right? So imagine that I have data, it's sensitive, and I want to make sure that I'm encrypting it to keep it secure, right? One of the things that we realized kind of early on in cybersecurity is that the state of the data, the state in which the data is going to define how we actually apply our encryption to it.
Right. Yeah, so like the methods and the tools that you would use to encrypt data at rest versus in transit are different. And this got, I mean, I don't want to explain your idea, but you came up with this really good way of explaining the identity problem, which a lot of people were underrepresenting, and not maliciously, but they didn't really understand. And what I mean by that is they were taking protections that were designed to protect identities at rest and thinking that they covered the risk for identities in transit.
Yeah, let me dig into the definition of that. So imagine that we take that dichotomy at rest versus in transit, and we apply it at the identity layer. So you have an identity at rest. That's a user account, right? So you have a username, you have a password, and then you have almost potential energy, which is once I authenticate as this user, I will have access to these resources, right? That's the identity at rest, but it's pre-authentication. The like I don't have control of that user yet. It just exists, and I know it's there.
It's like I haven't logged in the morning. The password's just sitting there.
That's right.
I haven't logged in yet.
That's right. And so and we have a number of security controls that are helping to essentially keep identities at rest, right? So we have things like multi-factor authentication, right? So it's maybe I compromise your password, and so I have your username and password. I'm able to log in, but then I get hit with that MFA prompt, and I'm like, oh man, now I'm not going to be able to actually control this user account. Maybe you vaulted passwords for a privileged identity, right? So I don't even know what the password is, or maybe the password's being rotated frequently, and so even if I knew it yesterday, I might not know it today.
Yeah,
right?
You use it to access and do some administrator activity. As soon as you're done, the vault rotates that password, and so like there's no way to guess it really. Or maybe biometrics, right? You're not even using a password. You're logging with a fingerprint or a Face ID.
Or a CAC, for instance. For those in DoD.
So those are all around the at-rest side, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's great. It's really important for us to make sure that when an identity is not being used legitimately, that it remains at rest. The problem is that identities exist to be in transit, which is in a post-authenticated state, right? So the reason why we create identities and we grant them access is because somebody's going to use them at some point in the future. There may be exceptions to that, like you have a break glass account, for instance, that maybe nobody uses until you need it, right? But in general, the vast majority of identities, including service accounts or non-human identities, are going to be somewhere in transit, post-authentication, in your environment somewhere, right?
Yep. Yeah, and so like the classic way I think people know to abuse this, or how the key ways where like, oh, identities in transit are a big problem, is mimikatz, right?
Yep.
So you log in, when you log into a Windows host, you create an active user session, and you can carve those, like, unless like recent protections, you were able to just carve those out of LSASS using a tool called mimikatz. So that was how we would abuse an identity in transit. So Jared logs into his computer or a different computer, and I can assume his identity by taking those credentials out of memory and then just using them.
Yeah, and the way we represent that in Bloodhound is if Justin has admin over a computer and I am logged into that computer, I have a session established on that computer, I've authenticated.
Yep.
Now we assume that Justin, via his admin control, is able to steal my token, dump my password, all kinds of different things. This actually leads to kind of an approach, an adversarial approach, described. It was originally described in the Shadow Brokers dump, but Will Schroeder kind of took that and talked about that at ShmooCon back in the day. But it's something that we call user hunting, which is as an attacker, one of the things that I'm really interested in is not just the access graph, who can access what resources. It's where are users in transit throughout the enterprise, right? So if I know that Justin is logged on to computer X, I'm going to figure out how do I find a path to get me to computer X because I want to take control of Justin's account.
Because I have rights over something that you want.
That's right.
So so you know that my access is this, and you're trying to find a route that, again, back to the attack graph explanation. But the identities in transit, there's a really dangerous, like, again, it's not just the password. The password is almost irrelevant at that point. So let's say that Jared logs in through biometrics and satisfies MFA, and even there's protections against like the LSASS abuses. There's so many different ways that you can abuse an active, like a log-on session, whether that be through token manipulation or process injection or like there's bearer tokens that are dropped now with like a lot of cloud providers. So there after you've done that, after you've used that identity and you've accessed it, that like no amount of resetting passwords, MFA prompts, nothing matters at that point, right? So, and that is a huge distinction that a lot of our customers have to really understand, or a lot of people just in general need to understand, is things like vaulting, MFA, passwordless, all of that is amazing technology, should be used, right? That's why we don't have summer 23 problems anymore, right? Like the simple passwords that are easy to guess, those are all handled for us by vaulting solutions. But there is huge residual risk in terms of the active sessions and the abusing of identities in transit.
I think maybe you touched on an idea that I think is fundamental to this discovery of this dichotomy of at rest versus in transit, which is when we were, and this is where the whole idea of know your adversary becomes really important, right? It's important for us to understand how attackers approach the problem of gaining access to systems and resources, right? One of the things that we observed is that red teamers, when they're in environments that have, for instance, password vaults, they're able to still compromise accounts that are vaulted. And so whenever you have this situation, I'm not necessarily accusing the password vault vendors of making this claim, but I think kind of like the layman explanation of like the outcome of password vaults is, if I vault this account, it's safe, right? That's the layman kind of description of it. But then as an attacker, we find this account, it happens to be authenticated or logged in, and then the common kind of response is, oh, well, that account was compromised, we should rotate the password. They rotate the password, and the attacker's like, okay, cool, I still have access to this account. And so then that kind of gets us thinking, which is, okay, my understanding of this system is that it's supposed to stop this thing from happening. I just experienced that thing still happened even though that system was in place. My fundamental understanding of how this whole thing works is wrong. And so I need to update my map. I'm very into this saying the map is not the territory, right? So just because you have a conception of how something works doesn't mean that's actually how it works.
And some things, if you don't understand this, some best practice can seem counterintuitive or kind of a pain to implement. Give you an example. Microsoft, this might seem abstract, but it's really not. Microsoft will tell you not to sync an Active Directory user to a privileged role in Azure. What they mean by that is if you have an on-prem user account, that you don't SSO to an Azure user that has a privileged role like Intune admin or global admin or privilege auth admin. The reason they say that is because a bearer token will be dropped on the target host. So like, let's say Jared is logging into his computer and wants to do some role or privilege work in Azure. He'll SSO and then elevate to Intune admin or privilege auth admin. That drops credential material, and it doesn't matter how much conditional access, MFA, continuous access evaluation you have deployed, that token is on the host. So if I can get to Jared's computer, I now can do anything I want in Azure with that role. That's why they say split those accounts or use cloud-only accounts, because they're aware of that risk. Spoiler, everybody does that. Everybody syncs those accounts because they are, first of all, unaware where they're doing it, but also unaware of the risk, right? So a lot of people are like, well, yeah, they say it, but like, why? Well, that is why.
And maybe we'll kind of wrap up with this point because we'll dig into it in a future episode in more detail with actual substantive examples. But this idea of in-transit identities is not limited to your Active Directory identities, right? So Justin just inferred that there's this same problem exists with Azure identities. One of the big points is that you are primarily operating from somewhere, right? And in a lot of enterprise environments, that somewhere is going to be your Active Directory domain. And even though you're accessing cloud accounts and cloud systems, what's happening is your identities in transit are being dropped on your Active Directory computer. And so that's always going to be this nexus of where those identities exist, right? And so attackers have, we're talking your Active Directory identities in transit. We're talking your cloud identities in transit. Maybe you have a GitHub account. Maybe you have a Snowflake account, something that we'll dig into more in the future. Your personal accounts. Maybe you bank with Bank of America or Wells Fargo. And when you log in from your Active Directory computer, you're creating browser cookies that attackers can steal, and then they could compromise your personal account. So this is just something that is very important for us to be aware of. And then where we get into big trouble is when there's kind of a dichotomous relationship between your Active Directory permissions and your permissions in some other system. So if you have, like Justin mentioned, if you're an admin in Azure and you're accessing it from a computer where you're a normal user in Active Directory, you now have a mismatch, and that's going to cause a problem.
I really want to harp on this. It is not just an Active Directory problem. Like, what if I don't use Active Directory? Maybe I'm in an OS X environment and I just use Jamf, right, to like manage my endpoints. But we don't have Active Directory. We use Google Apps or whatever. The same problem applies. The same problem applies. So you'll always have those, like the bearer tokens, cookies, you name it, on the host, and that's what we're saying. Like, that's how we abuse identities in transit versus at rest. So this has been awesome to talk about identities in transits versus at rest. We talked about access graphs versus attack graphs. Thank you for joining us on episode 3 of Know Your Adversary. Thanks a lot, Jared.
Yeah, we'll see you next time.